I was working the night shift in the emergency department at Seattle General when the first victim came through our doors, covered in blood and screaming about explosions downtown. That's when Dr. Harrison, our department head, announced over the intercom that we were dealing with isolated construction accidents and everyone should maintain normal protocols. I immediately called the trauma bay and told the charge nurse we needed to activate our mass casualty plan. But Harrison intercepted the call and warned me that if I caused unnecessary panic or deviated from his assessment, he'd have me written up for insubordination and my nursing license reviewed by the state board. 10 minutes later, 3 more victims arrived by ambulance, all with similar blast injuries and stories about multiple explosions near the waterfront. This time the screaming came from the waiting room as families realized their loved ones were missing downtown. Harrison came back on the intercom, insisting these were unrelated industrial accidents, and everyone needed to follow standard emergency procedures for trauma assessment. I looked at my fellow nurses staring at me with wide eyes, waiting for someone to make sense of what was happening. And Jessica, our newest nurse, whispered that her boyfriend just texted that there were explosions all over the Pike Place Market area. Harrison's voice crackled through again, saying any nurse who initiated mass casualty protocols without his authorization would be terminated immediately and reported to the licensing board for creating chaos in a controlled environment. That's when I made the choice that probably saved dozens of lives, but definitely ended my career at that hospital. I told the other nurses to help me convert the entire waiting area into a triage zone with every gurney and wheelchair we could find. And while they were setting up makeshift treatment areas, I called the hospital administrator on my personal phone and whispered that we had multiple explosion victims and the ER director was refusing to activate emergency protocols. The anniversary of the attacks approached faster than I expected, and the hospital planned a memorial service with speeches from administrators and a moment of silence for the victims. I couldn't bring myself to attend. Couldn't sit there listening to people talk about lessons learned and moving forward when some of us were still processing what had really happened that night. Instead, I drove to a different hospital across town and sat in the parking lot during shift change, watching healthcare workers arrive for their evening assignments, moving with purpose and confidence like I used to before everything changed. I tried to remember when that sense of professional certainty didn't feel like something from another person's life. My partner found me there 2 hours later, after I didn't respond to their calls. And they sat with me in the car without asking questions, because they'd learned when I needed space to think, and when I needed someone present. We'd worked through the worst parts together, the medication adjustments and therapy appointments, and nights when I couldn't sleep because of the dreams. Somehow we were stronger now, even though we rarely discussed that specific day anymore, understanding that some experiences change you permanently without needing constant analysis. The news kept running updates about the federal trial, with defense attorneys filing motions and the proceedings getting delayed repeatedly, each postponement feeling like another weight added to this thing we were all carrying. 6 weeks later, I was shopping for groceries when someone called my name near the pharmacy section, and I turned to see one of my former patients, with her husband by the prescription counter. She smiled and told me she'd started nursing school and wanted to work in emergency medicine because of what she'd witnessed during the crisis response. Her husband shook my hand and mentioned how she'd talked about my professionalism during such a chaotic situation, and neither of them brought up the hospital's administrative problems or my current employment status. The woman hugged me before they left and said she hoped she could be as capable under pressure as I'd been. And I stood there holding a bottle of vitamins for several minutes after they walked away. That night, my therapist showed me her notes, indicating I'd gone 2 weeks without major anxiety episodes, which she described as meaningful progress given the severity of the initial trauma response. I nodded and accepted the prescription renewal she offered, while trying not to think about how progress meant managing symptoms, rather than returning to my previous career trajectory. The urgent care clinic where I worked had smaller patient loads and more predictable cases, with people seeking treatment for minor illnesses and routine injuries that didn't require complex medical interventions. One afternoon, a mother thanked me for being patient with her anxious son who had difficulty with medical procedures after a previous traumatic experience. She didn't know about my background, and I didn't mention it, because I was just trying to provide competent care one shift at a time without my personal history affecting patient interactions. Her son had started cooperating with basic examinations and taking his medications properly, which felt like a significant achievement compared to where he'd been several weeks earlier. Sarah called that weekend to tell me she'd accepted a position as charge nurse at a level 1 trauma center in Portland, which would put her back in emergency medicine, but at a facility with better administrative support and crisis protocols. We met for dinner at a quiet restaurant where we could talk honestly about career decisions and whether it was possible to move forward professionally after what we'd experienced. She showed me the job description, and we discussed how her new workplace had implemented changes based on lessons learned from incidents like ours at Seattle General. The conversation felt hopeful, in a way that surprised both of us. Like maybe there were healthcare organizations that actually learned from their mistakes, instead of just protecting themselves legally. The medical supplies I'd kept from that night finally made it from my car trunk to a storage box in my garage when I cleaned out my vehicle for maintenance. I'd been carrying emergency equipment for months without consciously thinking about it, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away or donate it to another facility. One afternoon, I moved the box to a high shelf behind seasonal decorations and camping gear, where it would stay accessible but not constantly visible. I wasn't ready to completely let go of that preparation mindset, but I didn't need those supplies within immediate reach anymore, which my therapist said represented healthy adaptation to post-trauma reality. The urgent care clinic had different safety protocols and emergency procedures, and my new colleagues noticed I was meticulous about following them from the beginning. One nurse asked why I practiced our lockdown drills more seriously than required when other staff treated them as routine administrative requirements. I told her that preparation helps everyone feel more confident during actual emergencies, which was true without explaining the full context of why I needed that structure for my own psychological stability. She accepted my explanation and continued with her work while I checked our communication systems and emergency supply locations for the fourth time that week. Today, I treated a teenager with a sports injury who reminded me of some of my former students, and we talked about his college plans while I examined his sprained ankle and explained proper recovery protocols. Someone dropped a metal tray in the hallway, and it clattered against the floor with a sharp sound that echoed through the clinic, but nobody froze or looked toward the exits. I didn't reach for the nearest communication device or position myself between my patient and the door, or feel my heart rate accelerate beyond normal limits. I just continued teaching him about injury prevention and watched him take notes about follow-up care like it was any other medical appointment. The appointment ended, and he thanked me for the clear instructions before walking out to meet his parents in the waiting area, talking about his treatment plan and when he could return to sports activities. While I updated his medical records, I realized I'd completed the entire consultation without checking our emergency protocols once, which felt like enough progress for now. The federal trial concluded 8 months later with guilty verdicts for the remaining defendants, who received lengthy prison sentences that would keep them incarcerated for decades. The news coverage mentioned the healthcare workers who had responded during the crisis, but focused primarily on the law enforcement response and the victims' recovery processes. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I appreciate everyone who takes the time to read these long posts. Administrator said they were already getting calls from other hospitals, and she told me to implement Code Orange immediately, which made me realize other departments were defying Harrison too. We cleared out non-critical patients and started bringing in supplies from every floor, while I texted every nurse and doctor I knew to get down to the ER, regardless of what Harrison ordered. Through the automatic doors, I saw ambulances lined up around the block with paramedics running back and forth carrying people on stretchers. And some were crying, while others were shouting into their radios trying to coordinate with overwhelmed dispatch. The intercom kept cutting in and out, with Harrison's increasingly frantic voice demanding everyone return to normal procedures and stop causing hysteria. But then the fire alarm started blaring from the administrative wing, and his next announcement turned into shouting before cutting off completely, and then the intercom went silent. My patients were moaning and crying in the makeshift triage area while I moved between them with limited supplies, trying to look competent when really I wanted to hide in the supply closet and pretend this wasn't happening. We could hear helicopters landing on the hospital roof constantly, and every time the elevator dinged, dozens of people held their breath, wondering if more victims were coming down. The smell of smoke and chemicals started filling our air filtration system, and I realized something terrible was still burning downtown. One of my patients grabbed my arm and asked if this was some kind of terrorist attack, but I didn't know what to tell her when I didn't understand what was happening either. The sirens outside were getting louder and more constant, but they sounded overwhelming rather than reassuring. A paramedic showed me a message on his radio saying multiple buildings had collapsed near the market, and we should expect hundreds more casualties over the next few hours. The decision to expand into the cafeteria was easy, but finding enough medical equipment for that many patients was impossible. So we started improvising with whatever we could find, while the smoke got thicker and the casualties got worse. I heard glass breaking somewhere in the hospital, and more fire alarms going off on different floors. Then this terrible announcement over the emergency broadcast system saying there had been coordinated attacks throughout the city, and everyone should shelter in place. The elevator stopped working completely, and we could hear people running in the stairwells, some heading up to evacuate, and others coming down with more patients. The main power flickered, and went out for 30 seconds that felt like hours, and when the emergency generators kicked in, everything looked different under the harsh backup lighting. My patients looked sicker and more scared, and through the windows I could see orange light reflecting off the clouds from fires burning across the city. Harrison appeared at the end of the hallway covered in soot, with his white coat torn, limping toward his office while looking over his shoulder at something we couldn't see yet. He was whimpering, and his perfect hair was disheveled, and when he saw me looking at him through the glass doors, he mouthed the word, "Help," before someone in a hazmat suit guided him toward the decontamination area. The helicopter noise came back stronger this time, and through the emergency room windows, I could see multiple aircraft circling the hospital, with searchlights scanning the parking lot and surrounding buildings. A security guard appeared in the doorway and told us we needed to move all patients to the basement immediately because there might be structural damage to the upper floors. My colleagues behind me were so overwhelmed I couldn't even hear them talking anymore, and I started counting patients, knowing we'd never fit everyone downstairs. The guard kept repeating his instructions while pointing at ceiling cracks that hadn't been there an hour ago. All I could think was that we were about to lose patients not because of their injuries, but because the building was going to collapse on top of us. The structural engineering team arrived through a side entrance with clipboards and measuring devices, moving quickly through the emergency department while discussing load-bearing walls and stress fractures in technical language that made everything sound worse. The water pressure dropped to almost nothing, and I heard staff shouting that we were losing the main connection from the city system. Our backup water reserves would last maybe 6 hours for this many patients, which meant we'd have to start making impossible decisions about who got treatment and who didn't. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely start IV lines anymore, and behind me nurses were crying while still trying to work. From somewhere in the hospital came shouting that made everyone stop what they were doing, and I heard security guards yelling commands about unauthorized personnel and restricted access. The commands kept getting louder and more urgent, and my patients started panicking because we didn't know if this meant we were safe or if something else was going wrong. Some people were sobbing with relief when they heard official voices, while others pressed against the walls convinced that anyone in authority couldn't be trusted. I stayed focused on my patients, trying to figure out what was happening through the chaos of radio chatter and competing announcements over different communication systems. My phone buzzed with an emergency alert, telling everyone in the city to stay indoors and away from windows due to ongoing threats. The alert repeated every few minutes with slightly different wording, which made me wonder if the people sending them even knew what was really happening. Through the basement windows, I could see shapes moving in the parking lot, and these weren't regular police officers, but federal agents in full tactical gear with equipment I'd never seen before. One of them stopped right outside our window and looked through at me, holding up an official-looking badge while pointing upward toward the main floors. More agents moved past carrying detection devices and wearing masks that covered their entire faces, which made me wonder what kind of contamination they were worried about. The elevator system came back online with an announcement that only authorized emergency personnel could use it, and we heard boots moving through different floors while voices discussed evacuation routes and security protocols. But at least the explosions had stopped completely downtown, though smoke was still visible through every window facing the city. 45 minutes went by with us just treating patients in the basement while listening to official radios crackling with updates about casualty counts and infrastructure damage. And then 2 federal agents came to our treatment area, one of them explaining through his mask that they needed to verify we were actual hospital staff and not displaced civilians trying to access medical supplies. He asked what authorization code the hospital administrator had given us when we activated emergency protocols, and I told him she said to implement Code Orange for mass casualty events, which apparently was the right answer because he nodded and said we could continue operations. My nursing staff got back to work with renewed focus, but their hands were still trembling as they checked vital signs and administered medications. Even though their movements were mechanical from shock, they worked together without me having to give directions, because they understood that keeping busy was better than thinking about everything that had gone wrong. The agents were patient while we organized our treatment areas. But then one looked at the smoke seeping through the air vents and said we'd need to evacuate to a different facility within 2 hours. He used his radio to coordinate with transport teams, while his partner helped move patients who couldn't walk on their own. They lifted the stretcher cases and supported the ones whose legs were too damaged to bear weight, working efficiently despite the chaos surrounding us. I made sure every patient was accounted for before leaving, counting and recounting as they were loaded into ambulances and medical transport vehicles. The agent helped me climb into the last ambulance, and as I looked back at the hospital, I could see the damage to the upper floors from the initial explosions. There were holes in the side of the building that emergency crews had covered with tarps, and broken glass scattered across the parking lot that reflected the flashing lights from dozens of emergency vehicles. My stomach dropped when I realized how close we'd come to losing the entire emergency department if the structural damage had been worse. But I focused on getting to the temporary treatment facility they'd set up at the convention center, following my patients to continue care in whatever space they could provide. The convention center was organized chaos, with medical stations set up throughout the main floor and families searching for missing relatives. I started taking vital signs again and trying to look calm while inside everything was falling apart, reliving those moments when we didn't know if the building would collapse or if more attacks were coming. The paramedics brought in survivors for another 3 hours, and I stayed with the critical cases whose families hadn't been located yet, trying to provide some stability when their whole world had been turned upside down. A doctor from another hospital came over and asked if I'd been at Seattle General during the initial response, and when I nodded, he thanked me for defying Harrison's orders and potentially saving lives. That evening, I was in my apartment watching the news when they confirmed Dr. Harrison had died from smoke inhalation after being trapped in his office when the hospital's air filtration system failed. 2 other staff members also died, including a security guard who tried to evacuate patients from the upper floors, and a maintenance worker who was checking the basement when the first explosion damaged the building's foundation. I felt sick thinking about Harrison refusing to activate emergency protocols while the city was under attack. Part of me was angry at him for putting everyone in danger with his denial and bureaucratic mindset, but another part felt guilty that I couldn't convince him to make the right decision before it was too late. My phone rang around midnight, and it was Sarah Chen, who worked in the trauma bay and had also ignored Harrison's orders to maintain normal operations. She'd helped convert the surgical suite into additional treatment space after hearing the first explosion victims arrive. We talked for 2 hours about what happened and agreed to support each other if the hospital administration tried to blame us for not following the chain of command. She said she'd already heard rumors that the hospital's insurance company was more worried about liability lawsuits than supporting the staff who'd responded appropriately during the crisis. The next morning, I woke up to an email from Hospital Administrator Margaret Foster with the subject line, "Important Review of Emergency Protocols." The email was full of corporate language about following proper channels and not discussing the incident with media representatives without legal department approval. It warned that any staff member who spoke publicly about the hospital's response could face disciplinary action for violating patient confidentiality and institutional reputation guidelines. The tone made it clear they cared more about protecting themselves from bad publicity than acknowledging what we'd been through. I spent that whole day writing down everything I could remember about the attacks and our response, typing out exact times and everything Harrison said over the intercom, and what I saw in the emergency department during those critical hours. My hands shook the entire time I was typing, but I knew this documentation might be important later if there were investigations or lawsuits about the hospital's handling of the crisis. I included every detail I could think of, like which nurses helped set up the triage areas and who was coordinating with the paramedics bringing in casualties from downtown. The nightmares started that first night home, and I woke up at 3 a.m., sure I'd heard another explosion. My partner found me standing at our bedroom window looking for smoke in the sky, still half asleep and convinced something else was about to happen. The next few nights were the same, with me waking up in a panic thinking I heard helicopters or sirens, even though the neighborhood was completely quiet. 5 days after the attacks, an email came about planning memorial services for the victims, and there was already disagreement about whether Dr. Harrison should be honored as someone who died serving others, or held accountable for his poor decision-making that put people at risk. Some nurses wanted to boycott any service that painted him as a hero when his actions made the emergency response more difficult and dangerous. I didn't know if I could sit through people calling him dedicated and professional when I kept remembering him threatening to fire me for trying to save lives. On day 6, I received an official letter about being placed on administrative review pending investigation into procedural violations during the crisis response. The letter was signed by Margaret Foster and used formal administrative language about how I'd failed to follow hospital emergency protocols by implementing mass casualty procedures without proper authorization from the department head. They were investigating whether I'd acted appropriately by calling the administrator directly and initiating unauthorized treatment protocols that deviated from standard operating procedures. The letter said I wasn't allowed in patient care areas or to contact victims or their families during the investigation process. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah saying she got the same letter, and we should start documenting everything that happened using whatever records we could obtain through official channels. She'd already requested copies of the emergency radio communications and all intercom announcements that were recorded during the incident. I was sitting at my kitchen table when Detective Williams called to tell me they were treating the downtown explosions as domestic terrorism, and multiple suspects had been arrested at a compound outside the city. He said the investigation would take months to complete, but preliminary evidence suggested the attacks were coordinated by a group that had been planning this for over a year. My phone started receiving messages from other hospital staff, some saying I'd made the right choice under impossible circumstances, while others posted online that I'd violated professional protocols and potentially made the situation more chaotic by not following Harrison's leadership. One nurse wrote a detailed social media post supporting my actions, while another commented that I should have trusted the department head's assessment and maybe fewer people would have been injured during the evacuation. The back and forth between colleagues defending me and criticizing me made my anxiety worse, especially when I realized how divided people were about what had actually happened. Margaret Foster called me in for a meeting at the hospital administrative offices, where she kept emphasizing that my actions had created confusion during an already difficult situation. I told her the federal agents confirmed that activating Code Orange was the correct response, but she just kept talking about following institutional hierarchy and respecting authority during crisis situations. Her office smelled like disinfectant, and she maintained professional composure the whole time, like she was trying to be reasonable, while basically questioning my professional judgment. 5 days later, I drove to the hospital just wanting to check on some of the patients I'd treated and make sure they were recovering properly. The security guard stopped me at the main entrance and said I wasn't allowed near any patient areas while under administrative review, walking me back to the parking lot while other staff members watched through the lobby windows. My face burned with embarrassment as I got back in my car, feeling like I was being treated as a liability when all I'd done was try to save lives during an unprecedented emergency. That night, the local news showed security camera footage from downtown during the attacks, where you could see people running from the explosions while emergency responders tried to coordinate rescue efforts. People online started discussing how different hospitals had handled the crisis, but Seattle General's administration didn't comment publicly about their internal review process. Sarah came over to my apartment, and we spent hours putting together a timeline using our phone records, the emergency communications transcripts she'd obtained, and screenshots of messages from other staff members. We created a minute-by-minute account of everything that happened, showing how Dr. Harrison had delayed the appropriate response while we were trying to treat mass casualties with limited resources and no official support. The next week, Detective Williams called again, saying the investigation had identified the terrorist group and their methods, but it would take months, or possibly years, for all the legal proceedings to conclude. He sounded tired and mentioned that these kinds of complex cases move slowly through the federal court system, especially when there are multiple defendants and extensive evidence to process. I decided to visit the memorial they'd set up outside the hospital where people had left flowers, cards, and photos of the victims. Dr. Harrison's picture was prominently displayed with messages thanking him for his service and calling him a dedicated physician who died trying to help others. I stood there feeling conflicted because people had written notes praising his leadership and sacrifice, but I was too emotionally drained to correct anyone's misunderstanding about what really happened. The truth seemed less important than letting people believe something that gave them comfort, even if it wasn't accurate. Margaret Foster called me back to her office the next day and placed a resignation agreement on her desk, saying if I quit voluntarily, they'd provide a neutral reference and close the administrative review without any negative findings. She said it would be better for everyone if this situation was resolved quietly, and I could find a nursing position at another healthcare facility. The document sat there between us while she clicked her pen, waiting for me to sign it, and part of me wanted to just accept the deal and end all the stress and uncertainty. But it felt wrong to let them avoid accountability for what had happened during the crisis. And those patients deserve better than everyone pretending the hospital's response had been appropriate. I told Margaret I needed time to consider the offer, and she said I had until the end of the week to make my decision. Walking out of her office, I saw other nurses in the hallway, who used to be my colleagues, but now they looked away when I passed, because the situation had become too complicated and politically charged. My phone had more messages from patients' families, other healthcare workers, and reporters, all wanting different things from me. Sarah texted that we should consult with an attorney before I signed anything, because the hospital was trying to protect themselves from liability rather than acknowledge what had actually occurred. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 30 minutes just staring at the steering wheel, not knowing what decision would be best for my future or my mental health. 5 days later, Sarah arrived at my apartment with a stack of documents and a determined expression on her face. She pushed past me into my living room and spread everything out on my coffee table, pointing at different papers, while explaining how she'd been collecting statements from other staff members who witnessed what happened. Her hands moved quickly as she sorted through witness accounts and copies of the emergency communications that documented the timeline of events. She told me she was prepared to testify at any administrative hearing about what really occurred during the crisis, regardless of how the hospital administration wanted to frame it. I picked up one of the staff statements and felt overwhelmed when I saw how many people were willing to relive that traumatic experience just to support the truth. We sat there for 3 hours going through everything, while she kept insisting we had to challenge the hospital's version of events to protect future patients and staff. I kept thinking about how these proceedings would force everyone to revisit the worst day of their professional lives all over again. Sarah grabbed my shoulders gently and said, we couldn't let them rewrite what happened to avoid accountability for their failures, because other hospitals needed to learn from this crisis. The papers scattered when I stood up too quickly, and we both knelt down to gather them without speaking. She left everything with me, and said to consider what felt right, but her eyes showed she already knew what I would decide. I spent the next 4 weeks reading those statements repeatedly, each one making me more convinced that the hospital administration was handling this inappropriately. The staff described hearing the explosions and watching me activate emergency protocols, while Dr. Harrison kept insisting everything was under control. Some wrote about the smoke and confusion, and how they thought the building might collapse while we were treating patients. Others talked about seeing Harrison in the hallway after the air filtration system failed. Every single statement said they felt more confident when I ignored his orders and implemented mass casualty procedures instead. I finally called the hospital board office and told them I wanted to speak at the next public meeting about the emergency response. The receptionist's voice became formal when she recognized my name, and she said she'd add me to the agenda for the following month. I retrieved the emergency communications transcript my attorney had obtained and listened to it several times, memorizing every exchange between hospital staff and emergency coordinators. My hands stayed steady when I practiced reading my statement in front of the bathroom mirror, focusing on the facts rather than my emotions. The night of the board meeting arrived, and the parking lot was packed an hour before the scheduled start time. Hospital employees stood in groups outside the building, some holding signs supporting emergency responders, while others carried photos of Dr. Harrison and the other staff members who had died. I walked through them maintaining eye contact, ignoring the whispers and stares from people I used to work alongside during normal shifts. The meeting room was filled beyond capacity with people standing along the walls and extending into the corridor outside. I saw families of patients I'd treated during the crisis, sitting in the front rows with serious expressions. Behind them sat Harrison's family members, all wearing dark clothing and looking at me with obvious hostility. The board members arranged themselves at their long table, appearing uncomfortable as the crowd grew more restless. When they called my name, I approached the podium carrying my folder of evidence and the transcript from the emergency communications. The room went completely quiet as I opened my statement and placed it flat on the podium surface. I read each sentence clearly, beginning with the timeline of when we first received blast victims, and when Dr. Harrison made his initial announcements downplaying the situation. I explained how I contacted the administrator and how he threatened disciplinary action if I implemented emergency protocols without his authorization. The audience started murmuring when I referenced the emergency communications transcript, where the administrator clearly ordered me to activate Code Orange immediately. I continued reading about how we converted the emergency department and basement into treatment areas, while Harrison continued making incorrect assessments over the intercom. Some family members were crying when I described seeing him in the hallway after the air filtration system failed, and he was overcome by smoke. I finished by stating that I followed direct orders from hospital administration and protected dozens of patients who survived because we implemented appropriate mass casualty protocols. Margaret Foster stood up from the board table and approached me with her own stack of documents. She started questioning me about chain of command protocols and whether I thought I was more qualified than the department head to assess emergency situations. I referenced the emergency communications transcript and pointed to where the administrator had given me explicit authority that superseded departmental hierarchy. She asked if I considered the confusion I might have caused by defying Dr. Harrison's professional judgment about the nature of the incidents. I showed her the timeline, demonstrating that other departments were already implementing emergency protocols before I took action. She kept trying to make me admit that I acted emotionally or that I overreacted to what might have been isolated accidents. I stuck to the documented facts, reading directly from witness statements and the official incident report. Every question felt like she was trying to make me say I'd done something unprofessional or reckless. The crowd grew louder each time she implied I should have followed Harrison's assessment instead of protecting patients. After 90 minutes of questioning, the board members discussed the situation privately at their table, passing notes and whispering among themselves. They finally announced they were issuing me a formal censure for procedural violations, but wouldn't terminate my employment contract immediately. My administrative review would continue while an external committee examined the entire crisis response and made recommendations for policy changes. Half the audience reacted with anger, while the other half applauded, and I just stood there feeling emotionally exhausted. 3 weeks later, Detective Williams asked me to meet him at a coffee shop downtown, and he looked tired when he told me the main suspect in the terrorist attack had died by suicide in federal custody 2 days earlier. The individual was facing multiple life sentences, and his attorney was arguing that mental illness should be considered during sentencing for the remaining defendants. I stared at my coffee cooling while he explained how the suspect's journals showed months of planning these coordinated attacks on civilian infrastructure. The detective said the case would still proceed against the other group members, but it would take years for all the legal proceedings to conclude. Detective Williams left after assuring me they'd keep me informed about major developments, but we both understood there was nothing that would undo what had happened. The next morning, one of my former patients called and asked if I wanted to meet her for coffee with her teenage daughter. We met at a small cafe across town, where nobody would recognize us from the news coverage. Her daughter looked healthier than when I'd last seen her in the emergency department, but her eyes had this alert quality, like she was always scanning for potential threats. Her mother thanked me multiple times before I could even sit down, tears running down her face. Her daughter told me about the support group she'd joined with other attack survivors and how they met weekly to discuss their ongoing recovery. She said they mostly talked about practical things, like managing anxiety and sleeping problems, but everyone understood why they were there. They stayed for 2 hours and hugged me before leaving, and none of us mentioned that day specifically, but we all carried pieces of it with us. 6 weeks later, the hospital finally allowed me to clear out my office with a security escort watching everything I packed. My hands started shaking the moment I walked through the doors and saw everything exactly as I'd left it before that shift. My personal items were still on the desk, and my backup stethoscope hung on the chair where I'd left it. I packed my belongings into boxes while stepping around the areas where we'd set up the makeshift triage stations that night. When I got home, I found several notes tucked under my car's windshield wipers from people I didn't recognize. Some thanked me for making difficult decisions during the crisis, while others blamed me for not preventing Dr. Harrison's death through better communication. One simply said their relative was alive because nurses like me ignored bad orders when it mattered. I sat in my driveway reading each note, understanding that there would never be a version of events that satisfied everyone's need for closure or justice. The truth was complicated and painful, and looked different depending on your perspective and what you'd experienced personally. 4 months passed before the hospital offered me a different position in their outpatient clinic system. The woman on the phone kept her voice neutral while explaining they had an opening in urgent care if I was interested in staying with the organization. The salary was $15,000 less than my previous position, and the benefits package was reduced, but at least it meant I could continue working as a nurse and pay my rent. I drove to the clinic building the next morning and noticed the enhanced security measures at the entrance, including metal detectors and additional guards checking identification. The facility manager showed me through corridors that felt more like a medical office building than a hospital, with individual consultation rooms and equipment designed for routine care rather than emergency medicine. She kept emphasizing their focus on preventive care and patient education, pointing out safety features like panic buttons and reinforced doors. The other nurses I met had a professional but distant demeanor, like they'd heard about what happened but didn't want to get involved in institutional politics. One pulled me aside and mentioned that most of their patients were routine cases, but they occasionally dealt with people who had anxiety about medical settings after traumatic experiences. She said the work was predictable and less stressful once you adjusted to the slower pace and different expectations. I spent a week deciding whether I could handle working in a medical environment again before finally accepting the position. My financial situation was becoming difficult, and I needed to maintain my nursing license through continued practice. 6 months after the terrorist attacks, I walked into my new clinic for the first time carrying supplies I'd purchased myself, since the budget for non-essential items was limited. The patients looked at me with normal expectations, until my first emergency alarm went off during a routine appointment, and I had to excuse myself to recover in the bathroom. My hands shook so severely I couldn't remove my gloves properly, and I spent 10 minutes practicing deep breathing exercises I'd learned in therapy. Sarah texted me that afternoon from her new job at a different hospital asking how the transition was going, and I responded honestly that it was challenging but manageable. The state investigation report was released that week in a document filled with bureaucratic language that took hours to interpret properly. They mentioned delayed emergency response protocols and communication failures and inadequate crisis management procedures, but my name appeared only in the context of staff members who'd implemented appropriate medical interventions. The report made it sound like the problems were systematic rather than related to specific decisions made by individuals. They recommended enhanced training programs and updated emergency protocols and more frequent crisis drills, but nothing that would prevent similar administrative failures in the future. The federal trial for the remaining terrorists was scheduled for the following year, and I received a subpoena to testify about the medical response and casualties from the attacks. Walking into that courthouse and seeing the defendants sitting at their table in prison uniforms made my chest feel compressed. They looked younger than I'd expected and more ordinary, which somehow made everything feel worse, rather than providing any sense of closure. The prosecutor asked me detailed questions about the injuries I'd treated and the timeline of events in the emergency department, while the defense attorneys kept objecting to questions about hospital policy and administrative decisions. When one defendant turned and looked at me, his expression was blank, like I was just another witness, rather than someone whose life had been changed by their actions. That night, I started writing an email to Dr. Harrison's widow trying to explain my perspective on what had happened and express condolences for her loss. I wrote several different versions, but none of them addressed the complexity of feeling both angry about his decisions and sad about his death. The cursor blinked at me while I searched for words that could acknowledge both the harm his choices caused and the tragedy of losing anyone during such a crisis. I never sent any of those drafts because there wasn't a way to communicate something that complicated in a way that would help either of us. The lawsuit settlement documents from that period ended up in my filing cabinet where they stayed unopened for months at a time. Sometimes I'd remember they were there when I needed other papers, and other times I'd completely forget about them until something reminded me about the legal aftermath of everything that had happened. Memorial Day came 8 months after the attacks, and I made the mistake of attending a ceremony at the waterfront near where the explosions had occurred. The first ceremonial cannon firing sent me ducking behind a memorial wall while families stared at me like I was having some kind of breakdown. My whole body trembled, and I couldn't regulate my breathing until I got back to my car with all the doors locked. Later that evening, one of my former patients sent me a message with a photo of her college graduation, saying she'd decided to study emergency management because of what she'd experienced during the attacks. I actually smiled for the first time in weeks and sent back congratulations along with encouragement about her career choice. Sarah called me the following week asking if I wanted to join a support group she was organizing for healthcare workers who'd experienced workplace trauma. She'd arranged to use a community center conference room for monthly meetings with other nurses, doctors, and paramedics who dealt with mass casualty events or violence in their workplaces. We met every month to discuss nightmares, anxiety triggers, and the way unexpected sounds could cause panic attacks. Nobody tried to make it meaningful or find positive lessons, because sometimes terrible things happen without serving any greater purpose, and the only response is to keep functioning one day at a time. 4 weeks after that first meeting, my phone buzzed with a LinkedIn message from someone I didn't immediately recognize. The profile photo showed a young woman in professional attire, and when I read her message, I realized she was one of the blast victims I'd treated during the first hours after the attacks. She'd been looking for ways to contact me and wanted to express gratitude for the care I'd provided during such a chaotic situation. I stared at that message for a long time before responding that I was glad she'd recovered and was doing well professionally. More messages started arriving after that from other patients and their family members who tracked me down through social media or professional networks. Each message carried emotional weight because we all remembered that day differently, but everyone acknowledged how the crisis had changed their perspective on life and work. I'd started working full-time again at the urgent care clinic, a position that paid significantly less than hospital nursing, but allowed me to practice medicine without the intensity of emergency care. At first, nobody knew about my background or what had happened at Seattle General during the terrorist attacks. The work was routine medical care for minor injuries and illnesses, which felt manageable after everything I'd been through. But word spread eventually, the way it always does in healthcare communities, and within a few months, other staff members were treating me differently. Some thought I was experienced and capable because I'd handled a major crisis, while others worried that I might be unstable or prone to disregarding administrative authority. The truth was more complicated than either interpretation, but I didn't bother explaining myself to anyone because I was focused on doing competent work and maintaining my professional skills. Then one afternoon, my phone rang with a call from a law firm representing some of the attack victims in civil litigation against the hospital. The attorney explained that they were building a case around the hospital's inadequate emergency response and wondered if I'd be willing to provide testimony about the administrative failures I'd witnessed. She described how my account of Dr. Harrison's decisions could help establish institutional negligence that contributed to preventable injuries and deaths. I told her I'd need to consider the request carefully because testifying would mean revisiting the most difficult day of my career in a public legal proceeding. She called back several times over the following weeks, leaving messages about how my testimony could help other victims receive compensation for their suffering. But I couldn't bring myself to commit to participating in legal proceedings that would require me to describe Dr. Harrison's final moments and analyze his decision-making while he was dying. 18 months had passed since the attacks, and I was working steady shifts at the clinic while seeing a therapist twice a month who specialized in trauma recovery for healthcare workers. The small orange prescription bottles in my bathroom cabinet helped with panic attacks and sleep problems, and most days I could complete my work without my hands trembling or my heart racing when I heard unexpected noises. Those sirens and helicopter sounds still made me freeze momentarily until I could identify their source and confirm they weren't heading toward me. My new patients didn't know about my history, and I preferred it that way because I was trying to be a competent healthcare provider rather than someone defined by a single traumatic experience. A nurse from Seattle General emailed asking for advice about emergency preparedness because she'd heard I had experience with mass casualty situations. I sent her practical information about supply management and communication protocols, but I couldn't write about the psychological aspects of making life and death decisions while your supervisor is making dangerous choices. The hospital system announced new emergency training requirements with updated response procedures and administrative oversight protocols designed to prevent the kind of failures we'd experienced. I attended a presentation about the changes along with other healthcare workers in our region, listening to administrators discuss coordination matrices and authority structures using terminology that sounded more comprehensive than what we'd actually faced. When they asked for questions, I remained silent because I knew you can't solve institutional problems with better flowcharts and clearer hierarchies. Nobody mentioned Dr. Harrison specifically or discussed how administrative ego had interfered with appropriate medical response during an unprecedented crisis. They focused on procedural improvements rather than addressing the cultural issues that had created the problems in the first place. One of my former patients sent me a social media message with a photo of her wedding, explaining that she'd met her husband in the support group for attack survivors, and they'd decided to build a life together despite everything they'd experienced. Her smile looked genuine in the photograph, though I recognized the careful alertness in her eyes that I saw in my own mirror.